A homily for the Fourth Sunday of Lent. The church needs reformation, and reformation always starts at home. So, let's start with a renewed look at our gospel parable, invariably known as that of the prodigal son. First of all, try changing all the characters to women and the pronouns to the feminine, and listen to the parable again. Then, try mixing the genders of the characters and listen another time. I find that these seemingly slight changes refresh my imagining of the parable in surprising and helpful ways. Next, notice that the parable is the third in a sequence of three, following those of the lost sheep and the lost coin. Taken together, the parables are much more about the one who loses and the one who finds, that is, the shepherd, the woman, and the father, rather than about who or what was lost and found. In other words, the parables highlight, as a first priority, God's love for all people, be they the lost or those suffering loss. And the parables illustrate God's active search for the lost, and, for lost human beings, God's hope for their recognition that they are in fact lost and need to be found. These parables do not blame the sheep, nor the coin, nor the child for getting lost. Rather, they invite us to a complex and nuanced appreciation of the fearful shepherd, the desperate woman, the anxious parent, and of the wandering sheep, the lost coin, and the misguided, miscreant child. The version of the parable we heard today rightly blames the son for the purpose of succinct storytelling. But family life and human life are much more complex, and we must not succumb to one-sided blaming and smugness. So, let's ask some questions about these characters. Why did the son or the daughter leave home? And what happened to them afterwards? Were they 1970s student radicals trying to change the world? Were they undergraduates of today who became QAnon supporters or white nationalists? Perhaps the son was like Prince Harry, rather a hothead, but well-intended and frustrated by his second son's status. Trying to be his own man, he married someone who does not fit his family profile, and the couple's desires conflict with family history, placing him at odds with both his family and his spouse. Does he return to the family in remorse? Does he continue to love them but at a distance? In Harry's case, we do not know, but we can appreciate his conundrum. For a forgiving father or mother, forgiveness itself is complex. Yes, they love their child. No, they are not happy at the child's behavior, especially at the cost of the family's livelihood. They too must go through a weighing and a balancing, and we cannot judge them without knowing their story, since every story, like every pancake, has two sides. So far, we have neglected the older brother or sister. This character is often portrayed as arrogant and unfeeling. That may be true, but it is equally true that he or she may have remained faithful to the family and so feel an appropriate self-satisfaction. They may love the wayward one, but feel angry at the damage done. Prince William is a good example. Do you remember the 80-20 rule? 80% of the work is done by 20% of the people. This rule holds true in my human experience, and I have often been unhappy with the 80% whose work I am doing. So I cannot dismiss the older brother or sister if they seem arrogant. We of the 20% must not miss the challenge of welcoming those of the 80% who are so perhaps for good reason. And finally, let's remember that though the narration of the parable ends with a grand party, we must also ask ourselves how the characters will interact the next day, and the next day, and the day after that. The challenge of acceptance, understanding, compassion, and even forgiveness in the face of real failure, moral, emotional, or financial, is more than a one-day affair. The need to be welcoming, forgiving, and comforting confronts us all. Hence the Lenten call to greater self-knowledge, humility, truthful living, and engaging a process of letting go that may take weeks or months or even years. The reality is that living the Christian spiritual life is a lot harder than it looks. Hence G.K. Chesterton's statement that the Christian ideal has not been tried and found wanting. It has been found difficult and untried. If we want to give this parable its full explanatory weight, we might ask, is Russia the prodigal country? Is Vladimir Putin the prodigal son? Does God forgive Russia and its leaders and welcome them back? We have to say yes, as a matter of honoring God's infinite love for humanity and creation. But even allowing for the mystery of God's presence in the world, it is hard to imagine that God's yes is no more than a mindless Valentine's Day yes because I love you. It might be yes, full of welcome and forgiveness, but one imagines it must also be a welcome to repentance, remorse, and restitution as first priorities. God's call to recalcitrant Israel throughout its history helps us see that this must be true today. Notice how easy it is to be judgmental, like the older brother or sister. Judgmental of Russia and Vladimir Putin. Contempt is easy. What is harder, and all the more necessary, is the call to action to defend what is right and bring justice to what is unjust, especially when, for some of us, our role is limited to praying for divine inspiration and intervention for those who shoulder the responsibility for peace, justice, and reconciliation. 2 days ago, on the solemnity of the Annunciation of the Lord, Pope Francis consecrated Russia and the Ukraine to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, to bring the fullness of the divine mercy to the leaders and people of both countries, and to leaders and people everywhere. The Pope invites us all to join this prayer, especially for our leaders who work for peace and justice. So, as we celebrate Jesus' death at the hands of unrepentant evildoers, let's call on his resurrected love for us all, to name what is true, to press for accountability, and to rejoice in reconciliation as Jesus builds his kingdom of peace and justice.